Today, I am going to be finishing up the book, How to Do Life by Traleg Rinpoche. And these are the last two chapters, chapter 27 and chapter 28. Chapter 27 is titled Happiness, Morality, and Fulfilling Our Desires. And in these last two chapters, he sums up what he has been covering in the rest of the book. Now, he has a slightly different approach to desire, satisfying desire, and morality that Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche would use. It isn't that one contradicts the other, it's just a different way of viewing it. This is an important point to remember. It's a matter of emphasis. Traleg Rinpoche, he usually qualifies desire with the word excessive. He talks about excessive desire being a problem and that it's fine to want to live in a comfortable house, and it's fine to want to have a decent job and so forth. It's when it becomes excessive or compulsive and that desire takes over your life that it becomes a real problem. So he is going to be summing up his thinking about excessive in these last two chapters. As to happiness, it's important and fulfilling when we pursue happiness in the most appropriate manner, as opposed to just going about trying to be happy in whatever way seems appropriate at the time. Or instead of appropriate, I'm going to say acceptable at the time and acceptable to you, not necessarily acceptable to other people. So again, he stresses appropriate here in terms of happiness. Endless desire is common. If you aren't happy before you get what you want, it doesn't take long and you find that your happiness disappears or it's not enough and you want more. So if we're going to attain happiness or achieve happiness, we need to manage our pursuit of pleasure. We need to balance different desires. We have to realize we cannot have it all. There's no way you can have it all. And what is appropriate is based on the situation. This is actually quite difficult. It requires a certain level of wisdom and clarity. So for us, we want to kind of lean in that direction, go in the directions of developing so we can determine what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. He also points out that we can use positive forms of desire to overcome negative ones. If we put more effort and emphasis on positive forms of desire, the negative ones don't get as much energy. And little by little, we wear out those habits of negative desire. So, to sum up this, it's important to be intelligent about what we desire, to become more intelligent about what we desire. The next part I am going to title The Keys to Happiness. And he does not use that phrase, but I'm using that phrase. So, pain, pleasure, neutral responses to our sense perceptions are the basic choices we have. And this is to the basic sense perceptions, whether it be a sound, a sight, a smell, and so forth. But from that, then, our body, speech, and mind respond. And we get a sense of well being or ill being. What's important is if we can apply mindfulness and awareness, we see more clearly what is actually happening, what's going on. Actually, much of the time, it is what Traleg Rinpoche calls non-experience, and that is that we're not even aware of the sensory stimulus. We're not aware of a sound, a sight, or a fragrance, or whatever. And then from these experiences that we have, emotions arise. From there, then we have to know how to work with these emotions that arise. Tralek Rinpoche now talks about morality, and that morality comes from human beings interacting with the world. Morality does not come from a higher power. The Buddha talked about morality more in terms of, well, this is the way things work, and that certain behavior results in joy and happiness, and other results in misery and pain. So, this is a unique Buddhist view that ethics and morality comes from the way human beings interact with each other and interact with the world. When we see pain as bad and pleasure as good, this affects our behavior. And of course, we want pleasure and we want to avoid pain. When we understand that, we can relate to other people and their desires to want the same kind of experiences. He feels that most people eventually see, at least somewhat, that when you feel good, that you feel good when you do something for others. And he feels that this results in morality rather than from a higher power. Quote, we need to develop a personal morality that is responsive to the unique circumstances that we are constantly presented with. And this is a very important point he has developed right at the beginning. When we first come in contact with Buddhism, we are taught 10 non virtuous actions. Don't do this, don't do that. And the 10 virtuous actions, do this, do that. But as we progress on the path, things become more subtle than that. What is appropriate in a particular situation may not be appropriate in another situation. In other words, lying is a non virtuous action. Yet around here, during deer hunting, if I see a deer, and then later a hunter comes and says, have you seen any deer around here? I would point in a different direction to where I saw the deer. And that's virtuous, even though it's breaking one of the 10 non virtuous actions. So it takes some clarity, it takes being able to see what is required in this situation rather than just rigid, inflexible rules. He uses the phrase to be moral as meaning the same thing as to behave in a considered manner. And both of those are quotes from the book. So essentially, morality is a choice. Quote, morality has to do with thinking about welfare. Morality is contingent on the notion of well-being. So it's well-being for oneself, well-being for other beings, whether it be humans or animals. So I have 3 points to bring to your attention here. The first is there's a connection to people's understanding that the well-being of others brings well-being to oneself. This is an important connection. Also, not always, but usually, other people will return any beneficial treatment that you show them. And the third point is if you treat people poorly, they will return it to you. With that second point, that others will return my beneficial treatment to them, I think all of you present have been to the Hay River KTC Center, and it is a building that I built with help from friends of mine. And some of them I had helped with building projects at their place. And when they came and helped me, they knew that when they needed some help building, I would be there to help them. That was the way this group of us worked. And as a result, you could always have someone there helping you on some remodeling project, construction project, and so on, or whatever else needed to be done, even farm work. So this is pointing out that this is the way communities work. It's not something that just Buddhists do, that this is the way communities work. And when I moved out here, it was quite a bit different than it is now. Back then, 52 years ago, this was a long time ago, farmers would get together and do certain things together, whether it be various activities getting ready to plow and plant or harvesting. You would go over and help your neighbor, and then later on he would come over and help you do some farm work. This, I'm sure, goes back to tribal people and maybe even the caveman, that people need help. We're not totally independent. So with morality, communities continue and they thrive. The people have a feeling of well-being. They have support if needed. They have companionship, security, and trust. Without it, think about it this way. If you think your neighbor is going to steal from you, going to come over and have sex with your wife or rape her or whatever, maybe kill you, if you can't trust what he says or what she says, and on, any of these 10 non-virtuous actions, the community cannot thrive and it will probably fall apart. That these things are basic necessities for at least small communities to thrive. So behaving morally leads to happiness for yourself and leads to happiness for others. There is this feeling of reciprocation and interdependence. Karl Rinpoche uses the example of fabric, which is woven together from strands of fiber. And you really can't say that this fiber is separate from the fabric. Again, he's emphasizing this idea of interdependence or interconnections. So morality is linked to finding pleasure, satisfaction, satisfying desires, also wisdom, and realizing how we affect other people and other people affect us. It's also in our own interest to avoid doing things that leave us feeling worse than before the action. So when we can use wisdom when seeking to fill our desires, a lot more is accomplished in terms of happiness, satisfaction, and so forth. There's nothing wrong with thinking if I treat people well, they might treat me well. And this brought up something that Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche said, and that is that if you don't tell the truth to people, they will lose their trust in what you say. So it's another way of making this same point. Basically, it's in our interest to be a moral person. He then distinguishes between morality and ethics or being ethical. With morality, quote, we are striving and attempting to do what we believe is beneficial, wholesome, and conductive to our own well-being and that of others. And as I said, it kind of starts with the 10 non-virtuous actions. And as we progress along the path, it becomes more and more subtle and requires more mindfulness and awareness, more wisdom. And as you go on the path, you can use more discretion. Now, ethics are described this way, quote, in behaving with such consideration for others, we can develop a natural ethics that spontaneously arise. So you kind of come to embody the ethics. Every situation is unique. There are no hard, fast rules, that you are really relating to your own mind, relating to mental events, positive and negative. And we work on cultivating the positive and diminishing the negative. He talked about this earlier, the mechanism in our mind that produces negativity. These are negative states of mind or negative mental factors, negative tendencies, and so forth. We get to understand this process. We get to understand how our mind works and where our mind goes when something suddenly arises. You might say we get to become very good friends with ourselves. In this way, we realize we can change. We become, in his words, a moral agent, meaning an actor that acts in a moral manner. So you've come to understand there are positive and negative factors, how they affect your actions. You realize that rigidity prevents you from being an effective moral agent. So we cultivate positive factors, positive states of mind. We cultivate tendencies that reduce negative ones. Then this way, virtue grows. We cultivate the virtue and we get, you might say, to benefit other people in this way. So external morality is following rules and it's rigid, and then it actually can be non-virtuous. Internal then is more situational and so forth. And this is why Traleg Rinpoche says that a moral person can become virtuous, because if you are a strict, rigid moral person, you are going to be doing things that are actually unvirtuous. So we need to treat others appropriately with our actions of body, speech, and mind. Ethics are flexible and situational. That's how I would sum up that chapter. The last chapter is 28. The title is Happiness, Appreciation, and Intentionality. To begin with, he starts out, quote, "There is no contradiction in thinking that many different people can claim to have the truth," end quote. In today's world, there are many different views about what is true, and we try to lead our life in a way that is helpful to others, has respect for ourselves, and respect for all traditions. And this seems very appropriate in 2023, where there are so many different versions of what is true and so many different groups, many of whom are almost fighting with each other for their version of the truth. Happiness is on a temporal level, from having a sense of community, harmony among different groups, living a good life. This is important. This kind of repeats what he was talking about in the previous chapter. And Buddhist morality will lead you in this direction. It isn't a contradiction. We have a private life and we have civil society. Civil society is related to the state and what the state does. On the other hand, we are responsible on an individual level to act in accordance with what kind of a society we want. We can't blame the government. We have to be aware of our own actions and our own motivation, that change comes from within first. We have to avoid thinking that others have to change before I do. Or the reason why I have all these problems is that there are these idiots out there that keep getting in my way. He has a list here, which I'm going to go right through. Things to investigate. The first is, what are you like as a person? So do a little investigating, contemplating about yourself. What kind of a person are you really? Not what kind of a person would you like to present and have other people think you are, but what are you actually like? The second one, this is great. What am I doing? Think about that. What am I doing? Am I doing something that's meaningful? Am I chasing my tail like a dog, like a little puppy dog running in circles, chasing his tail? Do I keep running into the same conclusions time after time after time? The third is, how is my conduct with others and in society? The fourth is, what are my roles and how am I doing in these different roles? And we have lots of different roles. You have a role at home, and perhaps you have a partner. You may have parents that are still alive. You may have children. And if you have a job, you have another role at work. Then when you're out driving, you have a role to be a safe driver and a courteous driver, and on and on and on. In many different places, we have many different roles. When you're flying in the airport, you're expected to behave yourself and not make a big scene when you go through security and they find, shall we say, prohibited substances on you, whether it be a knife or a liquid that's in too big of a container. I remember going through security one time, and the man in front of me was dressed like a biker, And of course, he set off the metal detectors and he took off some metal and put it on to go through the x-ray machine, and he set off the metal detector. Finally, the officer said, empty your pockets. They brought out a knife about so big. And the TSA agent said, can I see that? And the man gave him the knife. And then he said, you can pick this up on your way back on your return trip. And of course, then so we have these different roles we can be in, and there's certain expectations. And needless to say, working with these things skillfully brings happiness. So we need to get to know ourselves. We need to get to know our weaknesses and our strength, make friends with ourselves. And he uses the term courage, having the courage to face up to ourselves, because we're going to see some things that we would just as soon, you might say, kept hidden in the closet. We have to avoid blaming others or the system for all the problems that we experience. We want to avoid seeing what we don't have and missing what we do have. If we miss what we do have, there's no room for appreciation, just more and more desire for what we don't have. It's amazing how so many people in the Western world have compared to second and third world countries. And I'm not saying that there aren't many homeless people, but when I have been over in second and third world countries, I frequently see people that appear to be happy, happier than Americans, that they might not have very much, but they seem that it's enough. Does having two groups, a red group and a blue group, does that make people happier? I don't think so. These are faulty approaches to happiness, thinking that if you have more and more and more, you're going to be happier and happier. Or if we just have two groups and I fight the other group, I'll be happy because we'll beat the other group, then we'll win. Another approach to happiness is, well, I shouldn't be too demanding of myself. I should be more relaxed. Just watch more movies on Netflix or whatever. Or we shouldn't have to do difficult things. Or if things change the way I want, then I'll be happy. All of this are detours that we don't have the power to change things the way we want, but we can adjust to the way things change. And if we don't put some effort, we won't change. So the Buddhist approach is to realize that the causes of long-term happiness are ethics and morality, moderating our desires, developing wisdom, and so forth. And what blocks happiness, the approaches that I've already talked about. Or you can look at it in terms of suffering, what causes suffering and what doesn't cause suffering. And basically, we look at what is in our long-term best interests. And we don't have to deny desire. He mentions a variety of desires. There are what he describes as terminal desires. It's terminal in that what we desire is the end product. Instrumental desires are we want things that will lead to a terminal desire. Then there are hedonistic desires that are based on pleasurable sense experiences. And non-hedonistic are more, we desire this not because of the sensual pleasure, but for other reasons. A non-hedonistic desire would be the desire to attain enlightenment, for instance. With all of these, moderation is important. He says it's fine to eat good food, enjoy it, and not have any guilt about that. What moderation means is to reduce our tendency to become obsessed with pleasure, needing finer and finer food, more expensive food, always wanting expensive food and gourmet meals and so forth. The expectations need to be realistic and rounded. Immediate gratification is a problem, but it can be tamed if we put effort into it. Our endless desire for satisfaction also can be tamed. obsessions can be transformed. He even says we can learn to dislike a particular obsession of ours. That's a really good way to tame an obsession, is come to dislike it. So the energy that we put in to these obsessions can be redirected in a positive direction. The search for pleasure can go into eating healthy, eating nourishing food. It can go into your home life, having a clean and well organized home, not a cleaning fetish where you're constantly cleaning everything in the house, but where you keep your home clean and neat and uplifted. You can have your energy focused on your family, on your children, on your friends, your relationships. Quote, we can appreciate wonderful times with family and loved ones, keeping in mind that all the experiences are fleeting and impermanent and should be appreciated and understood as precious. I think that's a great quote. So it's appreciating these relationships and working towards better relationships with ourselves, others, and the world. And to kind of sum this up, we do this by modifying and moderating our responses to sensory pleasure, to courageously observing our pain and pleasure responses, 3, understanding them as they arise and that they affect us. So when we can see this causal chain, you might say the mechanism works, it gives us tremendous power. Then he says, here's another quote that I really like. It is our own resentment, anger, and non-forgiveness of ourselves and others that have put us in this samsaric prison in which we live. So it is to examine these things and come to understand how these keep us imprisoned in the suffering of samsara. In terms of goals, we have the distant goal of enlightenment and true freedom and true happiness. And this is not contrary to wanting more happiness in our lives. We just need to have and apply wisdom to balance the different desires and pleasures that we have and to not lose sight of this ultimate goal. Meditation is a tool to help us understand this process and to balance the various roles, demands, pleasures, and desires we have. The meditation allows us to see much more deeply than we usually do. See ourselves as how we experience these things, how things develop. We get to see our habitual patterns and our tendencies. And with this, we begin to see that there is an experiencer separate from the experience, and there's distance between the two of them. And that eventually we begin to realize that this is a misunderstanding. The common word is misapprehension, or just simply confusion. This is the basis of samsara and the basis of suffering. And meditation allows us to be closer to the sensory experiences and the senses, and the thoughts and emotions arise from these sensory experiences. And with this clarity, we start seeing our motivation, our agenda. I'm using the term games. Maybe that's aging me, shows how old I am. Our strategies and so forth. We start seeing how this experiencer is doing all kinds of things, adding to, complicating what's going on. And with this clarity, then we begin to see the precision that is possible in our actions of body, speech, and mind. We realize we can be responsible for who we are. He says we can be an activist for a cause, but you're not going to puff yourself up with pride or use your activism to remove guilt that you have for whatever reason or prove that you are a good person when underneath you think you're really not a very good person. So besides the shamatha meditation, we need analytical meditation or vipassana meditation. And This is reflection and contemplation, and this leads to the development of wisdom. Shamatha, we do that to relax the mind and rest in tranquility, develop some focus. Then we analyze and look at the nature of reality. What is real and what isn't real? What is true? What isn't true? And we get a glimpse of how we embellish and alter our experience. So, Vipassana meditation involves looking slowly and deeply into our experiences and our responses, seeing how they develop, seeing how the machinery works, you might say, how we ignore some things, how we ignore certain patterns. And when we can start seeing this, then we take that insight into our experience. We don't just let it sit on the shelf, so to speak. We investigate things like permanence, impermanence, real, imaginary, and finally, now who is the experiencer? And the teachings of the Buddha state much of our experience is relative to something else. It's relative to our own experience, relative to something else, time, location, causality. And so investigate these things. This again is Vipassana meditation. Investigate causality, location, time, and so forth. So causality means that experiences arise due to causes and conditions, and it ceases when the conditions and the causes no longer support them. And of course, this also is closely related to impermanence. Things change. If you look at time, it's calculated on the change of matter, substance. A day is the length of time that it takes for the Earth to rotate one time, from sunrise one morning and sunrise the next morning. Then humans got a little more sophisticated and they developed the sundial. And then after that, they developed mechanical clocks. And now we have atomic clock. Well, they are all based on matter. Time is just all based on matter. And again, it's a very good indication of impermanence. So, how about location? Well, location is based on other places, other locations. I live in the west central part of Wisconsin, roughly an hour drive to Minnesota. And Minnesota is located just south of Canada, and on and on and on. All of this is just one thing is related to another. If we can understand this interrelationship, it improves our life and our happiness. It reduces unrealistic expectations, and we develop the Tibetan word is shera or prajna. He then finishes up this chapter by talking about the paths and the stages, which is this progression. So as we become wiser and more mature, we travel the path. It's interesting. He talks about in the sutras, there are comparisons of ordinary beings to children playing on a beach. And as one progresses on the path, you become less childlike, and there's less pain, suffering, less discomfort, and there's an increase in happiness and satisfaction. By working with our minds and our body, how we experience things, how we elaborate the various factors, and on, we mature. We let go of unnecessary junk. He uses the analogy of a boat full of stuff, and that these things hold us back, and it's like throwing things off of the boat, so there is room for valuable things on the boat. So we allow qualities and beneficial traits to grow. To kind of sum up this is the last quote. We can become fully liberated through the effective practice of meditation and through leading an ethical life. And here, meditation means both shamatha and vipassana. The question is, are there different types of vipassana? And there are. Just very briefly, it has to do with observation and then investigation and even questioning. So we first develop a good shamatha practice. It doesn't mean that your mind doesn't have thoughts, but the gross thoughts have settled down, and what now is arising are the more subtle ones. Your mind isn't agitated as much. In the beginning, our minds are a bit like a waterfall where the thoughts are just keep coming, 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 like water falling over a cliff. And when the gross thoughts are pacified more or less, again, remembering your mind is not solid and fixed, and gross thought can come up, and all of a sudden, off you are going over the cliff. But as your mind gets more pacified, the example is that the mind is more like a slowly moving river meandering in a wide valley. So there's much more calmness in the water. It's not going over a cliff, it's not rapids, white water. And when that happens, then there's more clarity, and you can look, and things like, where do thoughts come from? Where do they go? Where do they abide? And why is it that this gets me irritated? Or how are these things related? We just had that earthquake in Turkey. Now, what does that have to do with me? Other than, well, these are human beings that got killed too. Well, I have a jar of nuts that Target markets. I bought it at Target, roasted mixed nuts. And I looked on the label, and it had the country of origin, and it was listed according to each nut. Some of the nuts come from Turkey or could come from Turkey. So right there in my kitchen, when I eat some nuts, I have a direct relationship to Turkey and the Turkish people that worked to produce those nuts. And just thinking about these things, and on and on and on. There's just an endless number of things that we can look at and analyze and develop more wisdom about how things work in the world.